There's nothing more wonderful for a writer than to have someone actually read the books and understand them and engage with them, which is what Noreen does. And I want to thank the Center for Fiction for putting this on. For a fiction writer to learn, when I first met Noreen and I asked her what the Mercantile Library was all about, she said, I've changed it. It's now the Center for Fiction. We only support fiction. And tears came into my eyes. I had never heard of a place that only supported fiction, and this is what they do. So we are all grateful to her for what she does. And I wanted to thank you all for coming. So I think what I'm going to do is just read a little bit first. I'll give you a little bit of a setting, and I'll read, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book afterwards. But first I'll just give you a little bit from the book itself. So this is from the first chapter, and this is Conrad Farrell, who's 26 years old. He was a classics major at Williams, and he joined the Marines after his graduation, and has been in Iraq he's been in the Marines for 4 years. He's been in Iraq twice, and he's coming home. And this is his first landing in Maine, coming back from Iraq. The airport runways and buildings stretched out below them, straight axial lines, like a mechanical drawing. The plane dropped rapidly, and the long flat buildings, the dark tarmac, rose up alarmingly to meet it. The engines became louder, the pitch ascending towards some unbearable climax. The plane fell sickeningly toward the earth. There was a pounding inside his skull. He could feel it coming, the moment in which you heard the sound. It was before anything had hit, when the air was full of ozone, the moment in which you understood that something was happening, but not yet what. It was the moment that you knew in your body before you knew it in your mind, the moment when you felt the sound, like a great silence taking you over, the shock wave rolling through your body, your heart and lungs, time stopping around you, everything flying apart into fragments. That limitless, radiant moment, glittering behind your eyelids before you knew. He was frozen and still, his muscles clenched. His palms were sweating. Inside, he was huge and cavernous, and his heart was doing something monstrous and unnatural. Tears, horribly, brimmed at his eyelids. Some avalanche was poised, ready to break loose. He couldn't stop it. Something was running riot through him, some cloudburst of panic and confusion, noise and smoke and terror. He was consumed by fear. It was sweeping through him as though he'd been overtaken by fire, as though he were now rippling and radiant with flames. Somewhere he was screaming. Terror was blowing him apart. So that's Conrad's first arrival back in the U.S. Now we're jumping a few weeks, a little time. That was Bangor, Maine. Now this is Pendleton in California, Camp Pendleton, where the Marines are meeting their families. Near the barracks, a low temporary grandstand had been set up. The seats were mostly empty, but kids were running up and down the empty risers, chasing one another. The bleachers overlooked the parade deck, a big square field of scuffed dirt, now partly filled with waiting families. When the buses appeared from beyond the barracks, people began gathering. The buses were unmarked, but everyone knew who was in them. People turned to face them, holding balloons, waving tiny American flags. Homemade signs were raised. "Welcome home, Bobby. We love you, Jesus." Jesus. Behind the families, towering over the crowd, were inflated balloon figures, a purple castle, rigid pennants fluttering from its turrets, a huge red and yellow smiling bear. They swelled against the sky, weirdly smooth, like huge babies. The bus doors hissed open. The families held back, anticipatory. When the first Marine stepped down, everyone began to cheer. As the line of them appeared, there were claps and calls. Names were shouted out. Hey, Darrell! Yo! Jesus! Mothers waved and called. Children screamed joyfully, whether or not they saw Daddy. Wives began weeping. Fathers beamed and whistled. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. They've all lined up, in formation. The colonel snapped his hand down at his side. Welcome home, gentlemen. Dismissed, he said. Go see your families. At once the platoons broke lines. The men of Dingo 3 turned and waded into the milling families as though into the surf, the dense marpat brown mingling among the bright colors of the crowd. Conrad swiveled, looking for his parents, at the same time watching the reunions around him. Haskell, a grunt from 3rd Squad, had barely taken a step before he was seized by a beefy teenage girl with heavy arms and long, oiled black curls. "Bobby!" she screamed. She threw her arms around his neck, leaning against him and knocking his hat back on his head. Haskell drew back, tucking in his chin, raising his hand to his hat. But she was clamped full on against his chest, and she pressed her meaty lips against his. A group of plump girls in bright tube tops stood nearby, watching and giggling. Private First Class Jackson, 2nd Squad, had begun moving slowly into the crowd when a girl in a red dress came running through it and threw herself on him. She jumped into his arms and wrapped her legs around his hips like a monkey. It was somehow electrifying and obscene with the small children drifting past. Jackson staggered at the impact, but recovered. He put his arms around her and began turning slowly. Her red dress flared out around her in a rippling circle. Everyone in the platoon knew who the women were. They all knew names, pictures, stories. The beefy girl kissing Haskell was someone he actually hardly knew, a sort of long-distance girlfriend. They'd gotten to know each other while he was in country. They'd never even fucked. It got like that, though, people sending hot emails back and forth to people they barely knew back home. All that testosterone had to go somewhere, speeding out onto the internet. Jackson's girlfriend, Helena, the girl in the red dress, had been a cheerleader back home in Oklahoma, and Jackson was always talking about how strong and flexible she was. Jackson ate coffee powder for energy when they went out on patrol, and when he got stoked, you couldn't shut him up. "Cheerleaders, man," he'd say, shouting. "You have no fucking idea. They can do anything. Twist into pretzels. Yes!" He squeezed his eyes shut. "They bend themselves all around like acrobats." After that, cheerleader became code for anyone who could do something extraordinary. Bad guys, Alibabas, which was what you called bad guys, Marines, anyone. And here was the cheerleader herself, doing a flying fuck jump like a monkey as proof. Jackson was proud of it. That's why he was swinging her in that circle, her dress flaring. He wanted everyone to see it. In country, they talked about women all the time, on patrol, in the Humvee, on security, back at the outpost, laughing and lying and sweating and swearing. Once Jackson had impersonated Helena in a dance contest. He came out from behind a curtain wearing an orange towel and white socks, waving pom-poms made out of white paper he'd gotten from the mess hall. They'd all cheered while he kicked, raising his knees and grinning. Usually Conrad wasn't part of those things. As an officer, he kept apart. There was a lot he didn't want to see, stuff he left to the sergeant. But the men had invited him to the dance contest. "The cheerleader!" Jackson had shouted, waggling his eyebrows, swinging his hips inside the orange towel. "Take it off!" they'd all yelled. "Take it all off!" Now Conrad snaked through the crowd, pushing gently past Vasquez. He and his wife had found each other. They stood embracing, locked into each other's shapes. They were nearly the same height, and they seemed fitted together, eyes closed. They were silent, and Conrad looked away to give them privacy. He was glad Claire hadn't come. He wouldn't know how to greet her. How could he not kiss her? For 2 years at college, they'd spent nearly every night together. But while he was in country, they'd broken up, or sort of broken up. Maybe they'd broken up before he'd left. He didn't know where they were. Were they now supposed to shake hands when they met? When he next saw her, he didn't want it to be in public. Where were his parents? He tried to raise their faces in his mind. Had he seen them without knowing? He saw his father making his way through the crowd. Marshall raised his hand awkwardly to bat at a white balloon that drifted across his face. "Welcome, Tommy," it said. Behind him was Lydia. They were both smiling. Of course, once Conrad saw them, they were utterly familiar, tall and lanky, both slightly gawky. When Marshall reached Conrad, he put his arms around his son, and they hugged, shoulder to shoulder. Conrad was surprised by his father's body. It seemed thin and unsubstantial. Had it changed, or had he? Compared with the solid, muscular density of Marines, Marshall seemed almost frail. It was not the way he'd ever thought of his father. Conrad turned, and Lydia moved into him, putting her arms completely around him, and he felt the thump of her sob against his chest. When she drew away, there were tears in her eyes, and she was laughing. She said, "I had the craziest idea. I was afraid I wouldn't recognize you. I couldn't call up your whole face, only parts of it." The crowd was swirling around them. Jackson came over to them, his arm around the monkey. He stood apart, waiting politely to be seen. "Jackson," said Conrad. Jackson was short, with a long head and fleshy ears. He had low, beetling brows and gleaming blue eyes. "LT, I'd like you to meet my girlfriend, Helena," Jackson said formally. "Hello, Lieutenant Farrell." Helena smiled at him. She had a very red mouth, loose dark ringlets, and a small cleft in her chin. "I'm glad to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." "Glad to meet you too, Helena." Conrad nodded, not mentioning that he'd heard about her as well. It was strange seeing her in the flesh, lipstick smudges on her teeth, strands of dark hair clinging to her damp throat. Strange to see this physical manifestation of Jackson's other life, his new life, under this darkening California sky, a small evening wind rustling the leaves overhead. Strange to think that this was the last time he would see Jackson in this way. The balance had already shifted. Jackson's arm was around the monkey. His allegiance was now to her, or to whoever came after her. He'd never again be under Conrad's command. The last 4 years were being dismantled around him, subsiding, melting away in a silent cascade. Their shared life was over. From now on, for the rest of their lives, they would share only a past, never the present. It was as though Jackson himself were vanishing before his eyes, though what they shared would always be there. Part of their life was fluid, part fixed. "All right, Jackson, have a good evening." "You too, sir," said Jackson. Conrad thought of the monkey's legs wrapped around Jackson's waist, that graphic, flamboyant welcome, the public declaration of a different life. He thought of Claire. Everything was breaking up and changing. Thank you. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the book and the way it started and the way it grew, because it's the books that I write, I don't really choose. They sort of appear and in my consciousness and get more and more powerful, and then they sort of take over, and I don't have much choice. And the way this book emerged in my consciousness was because of an article that I read in the New York Times about 6 or 7 years ago, I guess. It was on the front page, and it was something that is common knowledge now, but at that time I had never read this. And it was about our troops in Iraq and the way they were driving in unarmored vehicles, sent out on patrols without any way of protecting themselves until they were blown up by IEDs. And they were suffering from traumatic brain injury, which, because of the military ethic, they were prevented from reporting. And when they did report it, the military, for a number of reasons, chose not to diagnose those injuries, because it's very expensive to treat them, and because that meant that the troops would have to be withdrawn from battle, and they didn't have enough troops. So the idea that we were sending people into this set of conditions was extremely troubling to me, and I started reading everything I could about the war, And then it became apparent to me that I was going to have to go further, and I wanted to bear witness to one soldier's experience in Iraq. So I started doing the research, which was the most difficult research I've ever done. Imagine to yourself a Quaker woman trying to enter into the military culture. Wrong sex, wrong religion, wrong generation. And although I was a writer, it turned out the military doesn't mind talking to journalists, but they really don't want to talk to novelists. So it was very hard to enter into the culture or to find people there who would talk to me. But when I finally did, I was given some names by people who knew people in the military, and I was incredibly lucky. So then I started a network. People would talk to me, and then they would give me names, and then more people would talk to me. And I drove all over the place, and I talked to people on the phone, and I talked to their families, I talked to their kids, to their parents, to their wives, and I heard their stories. And the stories were just so powerful and so moving. That they gave me this book. They gave me this entire world. And one of them is here tonight. And this was, I'm going to ask him to stand up. In this person, I was given my research trifecta. He was not only a Marine officer, he had also served in Iraq, and he's also an extremely good writer. And he talked to me for hours. He told me terrible stories, which I used in the book. He taught me how to clear a room. He gave me an MRE, which is a meal ready to eat. And he read my manuscript for errors, of which there were more than one. So Phil Clay, would you stand up? And he's also a wonderful writer, and his book, Redeployment, which is a collection of short stories about Iraq and veterans, is coming out in the fall. So I hope you'll be back for his reading. So anyway, that was sort of the way I set about it, and I read. I didn't read every book I could find about Iraq because there were too many, but I read more or less every first-person memoir I could find, first-person narratives written by people who were there, mostly by troops themselves and sometimes by embedded journalists. I didn't read a strategy or tactics or politics. I read really first-person narratives about what it was like to be there. And I read a very wide range. There are people who had very good wars, who went there and did what they were asked to do, and it was not morally unacceptable, and they came home and they were healthy and they were fine. And there were people who came back really damaged psychologically forever by what they had seen or what they had to do. And I heard from one end to the other of that spectrum. So all of that became part of the world I was writing about, and Conrad is who emerged, and this is his story. So if anyone has any questions about the process or any of my other any other secrets that I can offer you tonight, I'll be glad to tell you. Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one. You said that the military people didn't want to talk to novelists, but they wanted to talk to journalists. And I would think it might be the other way around, because unless they wanted to get the truth out, or, I mean, when you say people wouldn't talk, I mean, just sort of, could you explain?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The question is, what's the truth? Is it what a novelist tells, or is it what a journalist tells? Not that one of them they're polarized. I mean, you can both tell the truth, but this was born in on me whenever I saw anybody in the military during this time, I would go up to them and try to talk to them. And we go to Maine in the summer, and Bangor was one of the big airports where the troops arrived. So there were people going through Bangor all the time, coming back from Iraq in their beautifully clean marpats and boots. And there was a greeters room there. And it was famous, Bangor was famous for having this volunteer posse of women who greeted the troops. And so I went into that room and mingled, trying to look unobtrusive. And I remember going up to a woman in uniform, and she had just come, she was a medic, and she'd just come from Germany. And I said I was a writer, and could I talk to her? And she was very unfriendly, and she said, "Who do you write for?" And I immediately began stammering because, of course, I had written for the New York Times, which would make her sit still, but I wasn't writing for the New York Times for this. And I said, well, I'm a journalist sometimes, but I'm really a novelist about this issue. And I've written a number of novels, and every word I said just made her more distant and more despising of me. And I could see it from her point of view, because you can't trust novelists. You have no idea what they're going to do. They're not going to promise to put down the facts that you give them. They're going to use them for their own purposes, and you have no control over it. And one thing that I found very powerfully clear in the military is they're very, very protective and proprietary about their experience, as they have every right to be. So they don't choose to tell their stories to everybody, and they don't want to let their stories loose among people who are not going to respect them or tell them properly. So that was really challenging. They did not want to, and I volunteered to teach workshops for vets, and I volunteered at a number of distinguished universities in this very city, and no one ever took me up on it. They did. I think they didn't want a woman, and they didn't want a novelist. Yeah. So it was. I found this very strong, and I think those are the reasons for the barrier. Yeah.
I read the novel last week and really loved it, and I was struck by the way you used Sparta, a big city-state, and made the comparison with the training that our soldiers did. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, this is one of these found these gifts that novelists encounter while we're writing books. There's a very good memoir called One Bullet Away, written by a writer called Nathaniel Fick, and he was a Dartmouth classics major, and he went into the Marines, and he was a lieutenant. And so his book was infused with this notion of the ancient world and the Spartan ethic. And so I thought that was very interesting, and then I found that the whole Marine culture is infused with this notion, and the word Sparta is used over and over. They call their platoons Sparta, and they call it Spartans, and they call their combat outposts Sparta. And another Marine took me to Quantico, which for me was like going to heaven. And in the Quantico bookstore, they sell Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. So this is not just one person. This is an infusion of the Spartan ethic. And it's an ethic that is wholly admirable in many ways. It deals with valor and heroism and loyalty and discipline and courage. But there's another side to it, and I was fascinated by the way the martial virtues relate to the domestic sphere, and when one overbalances the other, what happens? And that's what happens when a vet who's been damaged to some extent in the combat zone comes back and tries to return to the civilian world. So the idea of Sparta was just a wonderful notion that was given to me by the Marines. Yeah.
I was wondering, how did you decide, since you spoke to so many families and got their stories, and you've written collections of short stories, that you decided this was going to be a novel and not another collection of short stories?
Well, first of all, I didn't think I had the right to write anybody's story. The story in here, Conrad's story, is not based on any person I talked to. Phil knows there are a couple of stories that he gave me, a couple of anecdotes, but I would never have given, the things people told me I felt were given in trust. I have never written those stories, and I never would. So, that wasn't my intention. It's not a series of sort of case studies for people to learn about the experience. It was, what is it like for a single person? And all those things went into it. But the same was true when I wrote Cost, because I went to a lot of NA meetings at which you listen to people tell their stories. And again, those are absolutely in trust. I would never have written anybody's story. But listening to the voices was what illuminated that world for me. So for me, they're two very different parts of the work. One is listening and one is writing. Yeah.
A couple of associations, if you will. Freud's definition of psychoanalysis is the talking cure. And you're talking to all these people, and you're talking to American society through your book. The results of that have a therapeutic value. I don't know how much or what kind, or how many people will read the book. You can't talk about things productively until you're ready for them. I would suppose people that are not ready for the tragedy won't read it, and they self-select in that fashion. But I'd be interested in your sort of free association to that.
Well, you said a lot of different things. It's certainly true the talking cure is useful, and that's one of the issues about the VA, that some of the vets are not given an opportunity to have talk therapy. On the other hand, talking is very difficult for a lot of these vets, and it's very hard for them to voice the problems that they feel about returning to this country. So I've listened to them talk, I've listened to them try to explain to me what their problems were, why this experience was so difficult. So that's one issue. It's not as simple as it sounds. It's not as simple as it might be just to say they should talk more. First of all, it's hard for them to talk. It's hard for them to articulate their experience, and it's very hard for civilians to understand what the problem is. Most civilians don't know there is a problem, so they certainly can't see how they could help. As to self-selecting, you're absolutely right. People choose the books they read, and if they don't want to know about this problem, they won't learn about it from the book. But I think that's the task of a novel. All we can do as novelists is bear witness. So that's what this book is doing. This is all I can do, is bear witness to something that I see and understand to a certain extent. Yeah.
Well, you said it, bearing witness. You know, I read in the paper a couple days ago that Gene Stapleton had died, and Edith, all his family, 90 years old, died in Manhattan. And, you know, one of the best times spent with my family was in front of the TV watching All in Family. And that 70s show. Not something I watched, but what was interesting about the characters in 70s shows was the mother, who knew everything that was going on, but she would never say it. Edith and Archie knew more than most people. When you look at that show, you see the bigot and the fake is really the one who's the hippie, Mike. And what's interesting about that and the whole Vietnam War thing is that I think more people who read these books, they want more of a personal experience. It's one thing to interview somebody and have them tell you a story. It's a different experience to sit down with somebody where they don't say anything and share a beer with them and get the full experience of what's really going on.
Right.
And I think more American people understand that experience more than an interview experience. America is a very strange, insidious place.
Right. Okay. You're right. Thank you. Is that anyone else? Yeah.
Roxana, I'm wondering, did you speak to a lot of women who were in Iraq?
Yeah. I didn't. I came to very early on to confront that issue, and my friend Helen Benedict, who is not here tonight but was going to, but she was doing this at the same time, and she wrote 2 books about the women's experience in the military in Iraq. And it's a very, very powerful subject and deserves a lot of attention. But I decided, again, that I had to focus, and that the military culture in this country is overwhelmingly male and always has been. And so what I wanted to write about was something that was central, although it wasn't my own, it wasn't related to me, but it was really the point of this long tradition, which was male, which was wholly male. And so that interested me, the male experience. So I didn't. I talked to wives, I talked to mothers, I talked to kids a little, but I was really interested in the men. Noreen?
Did you, the awareness of the problems of returning veterans has grown during the period you've been writing this book. You know, Michelle Obama has taken an interest in it, etc. I'm just wondering how it affected you as a writer. When you began the book, there was a sort of unwillingness for America to talk about this at all. And as you're publishing the book, I'm not saying that there's a flood of talk about it, but the situation is slightly better. Did it change the way you were writing as you were writing?
No, I mean, it was sort of a background rumble, but I was just going through all the material. I was really focusing on the vets, not about what people were saying about them. Mm-hmm. So it didn't. I mean, I became aware of it. It was interesting to me that it was taking on weight, it was a complete coincidence that the book came out during the 10th anniversary of the war, which I certainly hadn't thought of. But no, once I got into it, it was, you're just on your own path. It didn't matter what other people were thinking. Elizabeth, did you have something?
Yeah, I wondered how you were able to bear this, writing about this. I mean, you said you're Quaker, you said what you said. And yesterday, I was just listening to NPR, and there was a story about the soldiers who shot these two girls who were pregnant, and said it was a lie that said the father had shot them as a matter of honor. And I couldn't listen anymore. I turned the radio up, went straight to WXR and just listened to that, and then just kept flashing back just to hear bits of it. And for you to write this novel, you had to immerse yourself in this world. How were you able to do that?
It was like being drawn towards a dark star. I just didn't have any choice. And so I read the reports, every report I could find. One of the worst moments in Iraq that I think I learned about was the massacre in Haditha. I don't know how many of you know about that, but it was a very dark constellation of events, and Haditha was a very, very dangerous, hostile area. It was declared a temporary autonomous zone because the military couldn't actually control it. It was full of Taliban insurgents. They were imposing horrible Sharia law on the inhabitants. There were whippings, there were beheadings, there were knifings. It was horrible. And the Marines were under duress there, and there were terrible explosions. There were more fatalities there than most of the other places. And during one particular fall, there were a number of explosions of IEDs. And the thing about Iraq was that the warfare was really, every war is different because technology is always evolving. So they're all fought differently. But in Iraq, it's different, particularly because the enemy wasn't wearing uniforms. They weren't in platoons. They weren't in units. There was no territory for people to take over. There were never any set engagements. There was never tanks confronting each other, or troops confronting each other. It was firefights in the streets. Suddenly you'd be on patrol, and suddenly people would be shooting at you from somebody's living room. It was never from a fortified barracks that you could take over. It was all fought in the streets among civilians. Or you'd be driving down the street and all of a sudden your car would be blown up and the guy next to you had no arms. And there was no one to take out your rage and hostility on except civilians. And you knew that one of them had the cell phone and had pressed it and had blown up your friend. So you put people into this pressure cooker of rage and helplessness. And in Haditha, not only did they blow, I think they killed 7 Marines in one IED explosion, and one was said to have been captured alive and taken through the streets and tortured. So, and that's something Marines never allow to happen. So they were put under intolerable circumstances, and Haditha was not the only moment. So in Haditha, there was one morning in November, a convoy was blown up by an IED that had been paved. The road had been paved over it. There was no possible way it could be detected. And it was huge, a huge bomb that exploded and cut one of the Humvees in half, killed 1 Marine, wounded several others. And shortly afterwards, several of the Marines went into neighboring houses and killed 24 civilians, unarmed civilians. So that was something that it's horrifying to me. It's all horrifying. War is extremely horrifying to a Quaker. I mean, I was really brought up without any sense of it. My father was a conscientious objector. My brother was a conscientious objector. It was not in my world at all. But I was so interested to try to figure out what were the sources, what were the roots of this kind of behavior. And once I understood it, and that's not the only incident like that, I began to understand, and not to sympathize, but to understand why people behaved the way they did. So it's not that I became inured to it, it's because I started to understand it, and that was very useful to me. And it meant I didn't have to turn off the radio.
What did it do to you?
I'm still the same nice person that I always have
I don't believe
been. I am. I have no weapons. It was, it was very challenging. It was very compelling. It was frightening. My poor husband had to live through those years. It was as though I was living 2 lives. And it's the most difficult book I've ever written. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
Oh, yes.
Did you, by any chance, ever go to Iraq? And also, were the Marines isolated from, I would think they would have been very isolated from the populations in Iraq.
It depended on, I should have Phil answering these questions. It depended. Some people were very isolated, and some people had business with them and talked to them. I talked to one Navy captain whose business was to talk to the elders and the heads of the village every week, so it just depended on the situation. I was dying to go to Iraq. I wanted to go to Iraq very badly, but the whole time I was doing research, we were actually at war with it. And I found one tour, an archaeological tour, that was in Western Iraq, right at the tail end of my writing the book, and it was 10 days, and I kept saying, just 10 days, wheels down, wheels up. 10 days, I'm in, I'm out. I will just go, and then I will come back, and it will be fine. And I kept thinking of telling my husband that I was going to Iraq, and the State Department is saying, do not travel in this country, civilians are forbidden. And I actually didn't have the nerve to go. So, and now it's not the same place. We're no longer at war. So there was one, is that my student, Garrett?
Yeah.
In back? He had one last question.
So, if I heard you right, you said that when you were pursuing, the story that you tell through the novel, that you've not read about politics or sort of pursued that angle. But your starting point sort of especially political, at least the way I hear it, which is you send soldiers into battle and then you send them in wooden boats that fall apart.
Of course, I have a political point of view. I just meant that I didn't spend 5 years reading political books because I would never have heard the stories. No, you're right, it's a political book.
Well, I mean, I meant to follow up and say, so talk, if you would, for a second about the relationship between the story that you wanted to tell, Conrad, and the political stuff mixed all around it.
It's a good question, and I had to, one of the things about being in the military is that you're not supposed to take a political point of view. You can't. If you're being a good soldier, you have to obey orders, and you can't take a position on whether those orders are a good idea or not. So I talked to some people who were there, and they said, I never turned on the computer. I mean, I didn't want to know what was happening. I said to one, did you feel betrayed by Bush and by your commanders? And one of them said, I could have turned on the news, and I never did. And for one reason was that he didn't want to know because he couldn't do anything about it. And the worse the news was, the more despairing he would feel. And a lot of people felt like that. And some people came back and felt fine about it. I said to another Marine, did you feel betrayed? And he said, and he's very, very smart, went to Tufts. And I said, didn't you, when you heard there were no weapons of mass destruction, how did you feel about that? And he said, there just comes a time in a young man's life when he wants to go to war. So I just realized that my own politics were not going to govern this story. That I never voted for Bush. I didn't think we should go in, but that's a small part of it. It's a much bigger story. Thank you all for coming.